Welcome, Dr. Jerry Teller, to the Eternal Possibilities Show.
Thanks for having me, Jefferson. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Not to worry. We're here at the Austin Hospital, Friday afternoon. It's been a hot and sweaty day for both of us. We just finished lugging some emergency equipment around.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a nice little side benefit of catching up with you. Yeah. Bit of muscle as well.
That's it, the plot. So you're currently an emergency consultant, and I believe you spoke about taking a long way through to get there.
Yeah, well, originally when I was I did science originally when I finished high school, and I was always interested in medicine, but I thought during high school I was quite interested in music. I was our music captain at our high school and played violin, and I wanted to do music as well as VCE, and I thought, well, I really can't have it all, and I decided, well, if I still want to do medicine, then I can always do it via the postgraduate route, which is what I'd read about at the time. I did science, I majored in immunology, but I always really found the medical subjects the most interesting, particularly things like medical microbiology and pharmacology. So I decided, well, I'll have a go, see if I can get in. And the closer I got, the more I wanted to get into medicine. So did medicine, but at the end of medical school, I wanted to do general practice. So much so that I started a group called GPSN, or the General Practice Students Network. And ironically, I got to a point where I decided I don't want to do general practice myself. The vision realised itself, which was great. But then sort of went around trying to work out what I wanted to do, gave surgical training a try in the very early period, but then thought, no, this doesn't work for me. So I swapped some rotations with another colleague, and ED was one of them. And when I got to ED, I was like, this was the right choice for me. This was meant to be. And 7 years later, I'm an ED consultant.
Well done. There's quite a lot there. Let's zoom into first how you decided what fascinated you about GP while you were in medical school.
Yeah, role modelling was a very big thing. So when I was in my third year of the old course, I did a GP placement with a general practitioner called David Andrew, who still works out in Epping. And I just really liked him as a person, his style. He really represented the family doctor in my mind. And I thought to myself, this is what I could see myself doing, seeing people, all different walks of life, treating all different problems. And I really enjoyed my time with him. And that really spurred me on to wanting to do general practice. So I think it was the ability to look after all different age groups, that sort of patient interaction, which I do get in emergency, but in a slightly different nature.
Was there any one particular moment that stood out to you during medical school?
And as a whole, it's a good question. I think the most profound memory I have was not in general practice, but in ONG, when I was a medical student doing my ONG term and met a couple who were having twins, and they happened to have twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome, and their doctor was no one other than Sue Walker. And Sue's, in my mind, still the greatest doctor I've met, because I think she's just a phenomenal person and clinician. And I remember she did an ultrasound. It was in 3D, so both me and these children's parents were looking at their twins in 3D, which for me at the time, that was a relatively new technology. It was amazing. But the kids were in distress and they had to go to theatre. And to this day, I think it would have been great to have followed, but I think I felt a bit of a stranger in a very intimate situation. But what happened was that Sue got both kids out and the smaller one wasn't moving when the paediatricians had it. But Sue said, no, I felt the child move, do CPR. And they managed to successfully resuscitate the smaller twin. But then I saw Sue the next week and she looked really sad, and I said, look, Sue, did anything happen with those twins? And she said, no, but the father passed away. So he'd gone to work after coming in to visit the kids and had a massive heart attack and died. And in that few days, I saw just how weird and wonderful life and death can be, and how you can have two children who are never meant to survive, and then someone who by all intents and purposes was meant to live for another 30, 40 years pass away. So that for me stands out as the most profound thing. When patients say to me, when someone, their loved one is dying, like, why them? And when someone makes a miraculous recovery, why them? And I say, look, we just don't know. For some people it's their time, and other people it's not.
A lot of mystery still in medicine despite all the scientific advances.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which is good. It's what makes being human interesting and fulfilling.
And how about the period in which you set up GPSN? I imagine that would have been a maniacal effort, perhaps?
Yeah, it was intense. I was, I was studying full time. I was in my second last year, so I was in the AMSA executive at that time. So I had not only full time studying, I had almost a part time job being the national coordinator for the executive, and I was putting together this movement, which initially was unfunded, just asking people to volunteer, but then it ended up being a government submission. So I'd spend the day at medical school, then that night working until like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, putting stuff together, sleep for a couple of hours, go back to medical school, which I don't recommend because I used to fall asleep in my afternoon shoots all the time, and it was just because I was burning the candle, but at both ends. But when you're in that, for me particularly, when I get into that frame of mind where I'm really excited and enthusiastic, it just makes you think like you could do this forever without sleeping, but it's clearly not a sustainable thing to do, and I don't recommend it.
You're pretty happy with the way it turned out now, would you say?
Yeah, look, it was very successful, and ultimately, whilst I'm not a GP, the whole idea was not for one person to become a GP, but was for many. And when I was in medical school, 50% of the GP training places were undersubscribed, so not being filled. Now the opposite is true, where 50% are oversubscribed, so the mission's accomplished. What's left for the GPSN to do now in its current iteration is up to the current members, but I think making sure that general practice focuses on quality now that the quantity issue is addressed, but how do we make sure we provide the best care to people no matter where they live and no matter what services are around you? So how do we make sure that the care you get given by one GP is the same or as close to as the care given to you by another GP? And that goes the same for all of medicine.
That's a really tough call.
Yeah, absolutely.
Important question, but very tough question as well. And tell us about your intern year. What were your highs and what were your lows?
Yeah, I was really lucky. I had a great group of interns that we went through together, and I keep in touch with all of them through Facebook at the very least, and or socially from time to time. Harder to do now when you're married with kids, but still. The highlights were learning skills along the way and getting feedback from the people who were senior to me that I was learning and I was contributing and I was a valued part of the team. I loved general medicine at the Northern. It was probably my favourite because it was incredibly busy, but I learnt and saw so much medicine that it was very powerful. I think the negative things were the time, often not eating, being hungry, being tired, what seemed like endless paperwork. And unfortunately, as much as we tell the interns now, look, that's part of what you do, I still wonder, could we make it better? And I think it has improved since then, but I don't think you get the pat on the back for not eating and working overtime without getting paid. I think those are important things that we should do because that's what makes people productive.
The recognition for
being able to have a break. No one's safe on an empty stomach. So,
And how did you relax during those tough years and tough times?
Yeah, so socially we always had our intern drinks, and we often spent a lot of time catching up and talking medicine, much to the detriment of people around us. And I remember actually in Bendigo we got asked to leave a restaurant because we were talking about autopsies, and because in Bendigo the interns do the assessment of someone who's found dead on arrival. So you would go into this room, there'd be a body bag, and the morgue people, to this day, I suspect they were having their own fun, which I thought was a bit morbid, but you'd have to zip open the bag and they wouldn't necessarily tell you what you would expect. So we're talking about that, and then the restaurant owner said, look, I'm really sorry. I know that your doctor's at the hospital, but he can't talk about this so loud, so you need to go. So, but coming back to your question, social stuff, reading books, travelling. I bought a house that year because I was lucky enough that I could live at home during medical school and work part-time, so I'd save that money up so I could buy a place. So between that and going out and catching up with friends, that kept me pretty busy.
And then was it during that year where you found that your enthusiasm for GP got replaced for surgical?
My enthusiasm for GP waned by the end of medical school. So I remember I was in Bendigo for my last couple of terms, the last sort of what you guys do, this is the pre-intern year. So I did medicine and surgery up in Bendigo. And I remember sitting at my desk one night going, I don't want to be a GP, what do I do? So I thought about paediatrics, anaesthetics, radiology, and then surgery really came about. I started, my first term was Gen Surg 3 here, up at GI, and I really liked the bosses, especially Ahmed Ali. I thought he was just really cool, and he is. And my co-intern really wanted to be a surgeon, and I really didn't want to be a surgeon. So I said, well, if you want to go to theatre, I'll just stay on the wards. I don't mind. But as we went through, he wanted to be a surgeon less and less. And ironically, he's now a psychiatrist. And I thought, I really like the idea of surgery. So, and because I had really positive role models, and Ahmed sat me down and said, I think you'd be a great surgical trainee one day. Have you thought about it? I really became enamoured. And I think a lot of it was tied up in the self-esteem aspect as well. Like, I thought, wow, I'll be a surgeon. I'd be really important doing these things. I think I got swept away with that, and that's when the surgical bug got me at that point. But I did like stuff like lap stuff and, suturing and, but I think that there was a lot of it was the thrill and the thought rather than the reality.
The Mr. Rotella.
Yeah, well, not really the Mister. I'd be, if I was a surgeon, I'd still go with Doctor. I think whilst there's a tradition in why surgeons are called Mister, I think there's something very powerful in the fact that we get to be called Doctor. It's an enormous privilege.
And what caused your enthusiasm to wane for GP by the end of medical school? How did we get to that moment where you were like, oh, I don't want to be a GP?
Yeah, ironically, it was when I was I went and did my last year GP rotation with the same GP I did my first one with. And it was good because it gave me a chance to reflect. And what I realised was that it was more about the people I was with. And I think I'd become so indebted and ingrained to the vision that I felt like I had to keep going. But really what was driving me, was trying to get general practice back on the map, getting people talking about it and getting a good idea running. So once it had achieved that, it had lost anything else. So the best analogy I can give you is when you're dating someone and you really want to date them and you woo them and you chat to them and you do little nice things for them, you go out and it's really nice to begin with, but then it starts to fizzle. And it's not because of any wrongdoing, but purely your interests are just not going in the same direction, and it just reaches a natural conclusion. And that's what it felt like for me. So there were no hard feelings when I left GPSN. It was just, I felt it just reached a natural endpoint.
And how did you reach the same endpoint for surgery?
So I did neurosurgery in my first term. I thought... I did think about doing physicians after jobs were in, because I did general medicine and I did medicine back in Bendigo. and I loved neurology, and I still love neurology. It's one of my favourite aspects of what I do in ED. And I thought maybe I'll do neurology, but I'd already gotten a surgical training post. So I was like, well, I could do neurosurgery because I like the idea of surgery. I love the idea of neurosurgery. I'd read all these books written by neurosurgeons about their life and thought it would be hard, but it would be worth doing. And I said to myself, that's what I want to do. The truth of the matter was that I was doing neurosurgery because it was a very convenient way to ignore the rest of my life and put myself into work. And ultimately what happened was I got through and I was like, this is actually really depressing. I don't like it very much. One of my registrars is now the director of neurosurgery here, pulled me aside and he said, look, you're doing great, but you don't look happy at all. What's going on? And I said, oh, Gus, I just don't enjoy this. I don't think I want to do surgery. And he said, well, don't do surgery. We'll work out something else. And it's funny because, you think of your typical neurosurgeon in your mind, and I think to Gus's credit, it really showed that he was paying attention, and it's great that he's a director of the unit because I think he's got that pastoral care element, which is really important for future surgeons to have because it is a hard road. And Harvey Cushing, the father of modern neurosurgery, said himself, if you like anything apart from surgery, don't do surgery. But really for me what it was is that I was using it to escape, issues with anxiety, difficulties that I had in sort of dating because I was anxious. Like I would get really, I'd get either too emotionally invested early, or I would find myself really preoccupied and worried, if they haven't texted. So really in retrospect, I look back and go, wow, I'm amazed I got a date at all at that point. And it's just because I'd had anxiety there. So when we talk about staying up till 3, doing all that stuff, I think that energy was really an anxious energy as well because I was using it to try and get me to do things because I was trying to do stuff to help me feel better about myself, the self-esteem, the image thing. But it was good. It came to a head at that point, and it ended up being a saving grace for me both professionally and personally because it allowed me to get some help and address my anxiety and see, how much it was affecting me and really unpackage it. And I think because I did that, because I left surgical training and I got help with my anxiety, it's made me a much better doctor.
Would you be comfortable with sharing how you tackled the anxiety?
Initially, not very well. I used to have lots of trouble sleeping and I used to put it down to coffee because I would sit there and perseverate and it almost felt like I was manic. And people with anxiety do have a bit of a manic phase. It's just because your mind is racing and you can't focus. And one of the things that made it very clear that a lot of my decisions were driven by anxiety was as soon as I had resolved my anxiety by doing something, there was no longer anything left to drive it. So maybe with GPSN and maybe not as much with GPSN, but certainly with surgery, once I realised actually I don't want to do surgery and it's not making me feel any better, then there wasn't anything left to motivate me to keep going. I spent a lot of time. I was dating someone here, and it sort of fell apart because I think they wanted something a bit more casual, and I think I was just really intense. And it ended, but amicably. But I think for me, it led me to become more and more down. I started to become a bit. I started to have suicidal ideation. Started to think about what it'd be like to be dead. I had times where I'd self-harmed a bit. Nothing much because I knew people would see and ask questions, but I remember lying on the couch being quite down, and my parents saying, "Look, tell us what we can do to help." And I think there was a week where I called Lifeline 6 or 7 times a day just to talk to someone because I was so anxious, but I couldn't even connect with the idea that I was anxious. Really, my fixation was, why did things go wrong? Why don't I like my job? I'm meant to be a doctor. I'm meant to be grateful. All these sort of things. And then one of the guys at Lifeline said, "Look, you're just really anxious. I think you should talk to someone about your anxiety." And I didn't tell them what I did. And I felt really ashamed of being a doctor. Like I felt like, how can a doctor get to this point? Ironically, anxiety is super represented in doctors. And in fact, emergency physicians tend to have more common problems with anxiety. So I wasn't doing anything that was abnormal at all. In fact, I was working my way through declaring my own path. But I went to VDHP and I sat with a lady who's an anaesthetist originally, and it was the first time where I felt like I was sort of getting control of things and had a plan. And then I've been with the same psychologist since then, and what we work on now is very different. It's a bit more maintenance stuff. But it took years to really admit that I had anxiety and the extent to which my anxiety influenced aspects of my life. So, and now it's one of those things. I use a lot of those things that my psychologist has worked with me, and I apply those in my clinical practice. And I think I understand certain aspects of medical care so much better than if I hadn't gone through that journey.
That's really brave to put out there, and it's also really. I personally think it's quite an achievement that you've been able to come from that place mentally, even though it's not something that really you would talk about in a typical interview, but it's probably more important than, well, that sort of personal work I feel is more important than the work.
I agree. I think it's much more important than what I did with GPSN, and I think really after I started addressing my anxiety, that's when I've truly lived. I think I've always had anxiety. I think it's manifested more. I think from adolescence, anxiety tends to manifest itself more, but truly I think I've lived more in the last 7 or 8 years than I have in the last 35 years. Well, I'm 35 now, so what's in the last 27 years before then, to be truthful. Yeah.
What was there a episode that separated the anxiety Joe to the less anxious Joe? These two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the first time my wife told me she loved me before I had a chance to get it out. That was it's funny because you think, especially when you are anxious about your interpersonal relationships, and for me, I'd always been the one trying. Like, I always felt like I was trying really hard. And, I would often go in my own internal rant of like, what am I doing wrong? I'm a doctor, I've studied hard, I'm a nice guy, I don't hit people, I'm not aggressive, I try to be lovely to everyone. I'm like, what am I doing wrong, And people often would say to me, look, the right person will come along. And so for me, when my wife says, it could have been anyone, I say, no, like it was you. And I just remember that moment going, wow, someone who is saying she loves me, knowing all my stuff, because I told my wife very early when we started dating, I wanted her to know, so to give her an out, just in case, I would have completely understood. But the fact that she said that, and then from there, I think it gave me a new sense of confidence to grow from that hadn't been there before. And then since then, everything else that's happened since then, getting married, having my kids, finishing my training, finding a specialty that I love. So I love ED, I love tox, teaching. I think it's all sort of fallen together slowly from there.
How did you start to fall in love with emergency and we'll start with that.
Yeah, well, I came to ED when I was pretty down, but I found finally like it was a variety of work that I enjoyed. Like I liked having a different problem each time. I liked learning procedures because obviously that's what attracted me to surgery. I liked chatting to people, and Simon Judkins offered me a job. He said, we were in the tea room, and he said, have you thought about applying for ED? And I thought, is this the whole surgical thing again? But this time around, I'd already started thinking about it. And actually, it was one of the things that started making me become more motivated about doing something to address my anxiety, because I was actually starting to enjoy reconnecting with people and working with colleagues. And that's what I love about our ED in particular, but all EDs, is that it's very linear, that very horizontal, in that the doctors, the nurses, allied health, the non-clinical people all work together. There's no hierarchy. There's no I'm Professor so-and-so. We just all work together. And for me, that fits how I see society in the world. But it, I think that discussion with Simon was the start of loving ED.
And how about toxicology?
Yeah, I've always loved pharmacology. I worked in a pharmacy in the community for 10 years, from the year after I finished high school until my last year of medical school. Was it longer than that? It feels longer. It's about 10 years. No, it was, I think, from the end of high school, till the end of medical school. So it was almost 10 years. And I got to learn a lot about medications. I got to look after different people. So Northcote wasn't as trendy and glitzy as it is now. So we had people who used to chrome, people who would sometimes sell their Oxynorm to make enough money to pay their bills, or on good days they might take a bit extra. So I got to see all walks of life, people with intellectual disabilities who were relying on the pharmacy not only for their medications, but that was their daily visit, their daily chat. And I got to meet a whole variety of people who had various health problems, and talking to them and getting a feel for how they saw their health, how they viewed their health. And that's what really reaffirmed for me that medicine was going to be a good thing. So really enjoyed pharmacy, enjoyed medications and pharmacology. So I went along to the toxicology forum when I was in my first year of being a registrar. I was actually a resident, I hadn't become a registrar formally. And I heard the tox forum and I just loved it. I sat there going, everything these people are saying is stuff that interests me. When I was in primary school, there was a book called Australia's Deadliest Animals, which I would borrow over and over again, about snakes and spiders. And so it all sort of just came to a head that I wanted to do tox. So I spoke to Sean Green, who for me is my mentor and hero for me, but he's also my boss now, and said, what do I do to become a toxicologist? So I did my primary exams, which are the 4 basic sciences as part of your ED training. Did a tox rotation just shortly before I got married, and then waited, and now I'm doing the Tox Fellowship and finishing off a Masters of Medical Toxicology.
Oh, wow.
And it's been great, yeah. Excuse me.
No worries. And the last thing we might touch on is the teaching. I think I've been in your clinical shoots this year. I think we've really appreciated your efforts. We've been really involved with the emergency medicine competitions that we have in Melbourne Medical School, and I think I've seen your name twice on the board of Austin Clinical Teaching. Tell us how that's come about and how that's been really good for you.
Yeah, look, I really valued the teachers who were excellent during medical school. So Sue was certainly one of them. Michael Permazel. There's a few that their names don't spring to mind. Richard and Barb were and are great educators, and I always felt like that was just part of what you should do as a clinician. And the thing I like about teaching and about tox as well is that they both really enhance my teaching, because if my clinical skills, because if I can't explain to a medical student why I'm doing a particular test or doing an examination, then how do I explain that to a patient? So I really enjoy teaching. I think it keeps me honest. I think it allows me to give back for all the teaching I had and all the opportunities I've had. And it sustains me. I think I would be happy to continue to do it long term. And certainly one day, the opportunity's not there just yet, but one day it'd be great to do a bit more full-time, a bit more, teaching as a bigger block of what I do. But, teachers are amazing. I remember every teacher I've had since primary school, And the ones that really stood out are the ones where the things they taught me still stick. And I think just like primary school, secondary school, university, the opportunity to be a teacher is a chance to role model. And for me, I think it's a chance to show medical students how to treat particular patient groups. I work with the patients that lots of people don't like to look after, so people who are drug addicts, people who are depressed, who are suicidal. That's one of the other things that drew me to Tox, was because I've been very close to my patient group in the past, and I'd like to, model compassion and empathy and an understanding for those patients. But also just because I've been, my parents have been patients here, my grandparents, my grandmother when she was alive was here as well, and I think, I'd like to help contribute in any way to doctors becoming those exemplary doctors who families go, I'm worried about my loved one, but I'm relieved because that doctor really shows they care. And ultimately, I think that's got more value than a role or a title or a Mr. or a Professor. And if the only thing I really do is show people, the importance of compassion for your patients, then that's okay. I'm very happy with that being my only contribution.
It's the human touch that's the most important.
Yeah, well, look, we have so many amazing tests. We can diagnose someone almost remotely by blood tests and imaging. But the things that matter for patients is how you talk to them, how you examine them. There's a great video called the Doctor's Touch on YouTube. It's a TED Talk, and this clinician talks about how the nature of being examined is so ritual that patients will start, and you'll see yourself when you go and see a patient, they start removing their clothes because they are expecting it. They want you to do it. And I've seen patients who've wanted to be examined and the doctor hasn't examined them. And you can see they're almost left feeling like they've been it's a bit half-baked. Excuse me. So one of the things especially for patients where it's not clear what's going on, doing that thorough exam, looking over things, really paying attention is as therapeutic more therapeutic than doing a blood test. There's a lot of patients who don't believe you. If you say, oh, look, your blood tests are all okay, you can go home. But doctor, you haven't really looked at me. So that's why I like clinical skills coaching in particular, because I think that's a really powerful thing that will help going down the track. Because there are people we won't have any idea what's going on or why they have the symptom they have. But I've never met a patient who, after I've examined them, has said to me, you haven't done enough,
Very, very much a doctor's touch there. And 2 questions that I ask every time.
Yep.
First is, if you could have a gigantic billboard anywhere with anything on it, metaphorically speaking, getting a message out there to millions or billions, what would it say and why? Could be a few words or a paragraph.
Okay. I have to think about this. Oh, actually, I can use one. So my email signature is a quote by Albert Einstein, which is, it is better to be a person of value than... Oh, actually, I've gone blank. Let me read it out so it's correct.
That's all right.
I was fortunate enough to be the valedictorian for our year. And so I gave this quote, and then it's become my... that's right. It's better to be a person of value than to be a person of success. Paraphrased.
And what advice do you think medical students and young doctors should ignore that they hear too much?
Being a doctor is the most important thing you'll ever do in your life. That's bullshit.
And are there any other messages or stories that you'd like to get out there?
No, I think the key thing is that it's important to remember that medicine is just part of who you are. It never defines your identity, nor should it ever try to. And it's important, as hard as it is, and I think it's the personality types that we are, it's really important to find joy in other aspects of your life. You know, when you become a parent, when you're a partner, in an activity, in a pursuit, in a passion, in travelling, you know, you might not want to have a family or not want to have children or not even be partnered. And certainly some of my friends have made that decision, but they all have something they're passionate about outside of medicine. Because unfortunately, medicine is a fleeting gift. Tomorrow, if you're a surgeon, your hands get chopped off. You need to have something else. It's not necessarily a plan B, but you need to have something to sustain you. So the best advice I can say is if you have a passion, if you have something you enjoy and you love, don't leave it aside so you can progress your career. You need to learn how to progress your career whilst you maintain that passion.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Joe, for taking the time this afternoon to come and have a chat.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.